And it was, it was a part that I'd really wanted before. And I remember walking out, the meeting was here in New York, and I remember walking out so sort of high from that meeting because I just knew how good the writing was in that thing, and the opportunity to do that caliber of language and dialogue on film, to me, was like a gift.
Very warm welcome to Clive Owen.
Thank you.
And I'm going to start off with a few questions about words and pictures before we go a little wider into your career, and we will take a few questions from the audience towards the end. I understand that you were attached to this film from the beginning and had to wait about 3 years until it actually got made. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little about what drew you to it and why you stuck with it for as long as you did. And I know that part of your answer has to be the screenplay. I didn't talk about the screenwriter Gerard DiPego beforehand because this is where I think we should get into that. But
I mean, it always starts with the script, really. I knew Fred socially for a while, and I'd always liked him, and I'd liked the idea of working with him. And then he sent me this script, and I was just really taken with it. I thought it was very beautifully written. It read like a play, really. It was incredibly well structured. The dialogue was great, had great kind of rhythm, wit, humor. And it was, rare to read something that you would call a romantic comedy, but was also very poignant, very moving, very emotional, and it also smelt real. I didn't feel it was romantic in a cute way or for effect. It felt very genuine. So I was very taken with it, and it did take a while to come together, and it was one of those that every so often I'd go back to it and realize I didn't want to let it go, that I really, that every time I'd leave it for 6 months, read it again, I'd go, yeah, I definitely want to stick with this and see it through.
Now, it seems to me that you have more pages of dialogue to say continuously than in most films that I come across. This is a very language-heavy movie. Was it particularly challenging, for example, the classroom scenes, and I'm guessing that there were more than 1 or 2 takes, to be able to maintain that kind of verbal flow over many pages?
Yeah, I mean, it was particularly difficult because I think about 3 days before we started shooting, there was a schedule shift. I can't remember for what reason, and Fred said, "I'm sorry to do this to you, mate, but we're starting in the classroom." So the first 3 or 4 days of the shoot were those scenes. So that was pretty daunting. What was the challenge for me is, I think at the beginning of the film, he's very jaded, he's very beaten, and that's at the beginning of the film. And the whole thing that happens when Juliet's character arrives at the school kind of reignites him and wakes him up. And it was important to me to try and find that journey and make sure, which is quite hard because you've got to make sure that the first scenes are kind of flatter, that he's jaded, he's kind of beaten down, and gradually he has to get more and more enthusiastic. I mean, partly because he's trying to save his job, but also, what happens when Juliet's character arrives at the school is it reawakens his passion, and he gets back to probably teaching like he used to.
And Gerard DiPego had been a high school English teacher?
I think he had, yeah.
I mean, do we know to what extent he fabricated a lot of this, and to what extent he had experience of this kind of thing?
No, I'm not 100% sure of that, but he's, it really did read like a piece of theatre. It was that well crafted. It was, it was a piece of writing that was incredibly well honed, and obviously he was very good at the rhythm of the piece. The language had the banter between the two of them had a great sort of rhythm.
Was that wonderful rhythm that we see on the screen a function of much rehearsal? Was there any improvisation? Because you and Juliette Binoche, I did believe in all the various stages of the relationship. The initial friction with the attraction, then the coming together, the coming apart.
We didn't do an awful lot. We didn't sort of over-rehearse the scenes. No, we talked a lot, and we did have a kind of rehearsal period, but very often on films, those rehearsal periods, you have to be careful of not killing the scenes. If you work them too much, you kind of can overdo them. But I was a huge fan of Juliet's. I've always thought she was one of the greatest out there, and I was absolutely thrilled when she wanted to do it. And we met, and we realized very quickly that we got along very well. But what was also very important and helped enormously is we got a very similar sense of humor. And I think the very first scene we shot, we made each other laugh for real. And it was a very good start. And there was something straight away that we both felt free to play and push and prod and surprise, and that kind of, is the sort of magic that you're always after, really.
As long as you mention her and her extraordinary talents, were you aware when the film began shooting that she was capable of doing the artwork that we see in the film? Did that develop as the shoot progressed?
It did, it did as well. I think when Fred, talked to her about playing the part, he knew that she was an artist, but he didn't know to what extent. And then right from the beginning of the thing, there was an awful lot of her work, but there was work that Fred was very specific about, the kind of thing that he wanted as the film progressed. And Juliet also developed a new kind of style of painting that fitted in with what she was going through. So it did develop as the film went through, but you knew right at the beginning of the film that she was a pretty serious artist.
You knew. I have to confess, when I first saw this film about a month ago, I had no idea that Binoche was doing her own artwork. I assumed there was a double. And when I read in the final credits that it was all hers, I gasped, because it was yet another feather in her extraordinary cap. And I learned afterwards that her father had been a sculptor as well as a theater director, and her mother had been a teacher. So I guess she did see this as a way of bringing together some ancestral threads.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Now, in this film, your character, Jack, loves language. And what a wordsmith he is, as we can see. And even if it's persuasive when Dina tells her class that words are lies, traps, they can be, heaven knows, you, later in the film, have the haiku, the early tweet. You quote from Eiji, for example. And it led me to wonder whether for you as an actor, which is more important, the words, in other words, those words that you're going to say from the script, or, quote, image, the picture, a certain kind of physical incarnation of the character that you're playing. And by the way, maybe they can't be separated.
Yeah, I'm not sure they can be separated, because often I think the physicality comes from the language of who the guy is and how they speak. It often dictates how you are physically. I mean, language is hugely important. I started in the theatre, I trained in the theatre, and it's everything. It's the tool with which you go to work. And I've read scripts that have great stories and not very good dialogue, and I can't do them. I learned at a very young age, if you say bad lines of dialogue, you look like a bad actor. If the lines aren't smart, you look dumb. And so having great language is always very, very exciting to me. And I've done films that have, doing Closer, which was a play turned into a film. It's totally based in the language and the rhythm of the language. But I've also done other films where, you look at something like Children of Men, where dialogue isn't the most important thing. And that's, you've got someone like Alfonso Cuarón, who's a brilliant storyteller visually. And very often in those films, I'll be somebody who takes away the dialogue. Because if I think it's over-explaining or it's unnecessary, it's better not to do it. So it really is dependent on the piece. Now, with this piece, as I said before, it read like a play, and language is hugely important to that character. So I embraced all of the dialogue, and although it's very dialogue heavy, I could see why it was.
Yeah. It also makes even more striking the scenes where your character gets drunk and cannot speak. I mean, language is just not part of it. For example, hitting with the racket, that ball, all the kind of externalized violence, the physicality of it, seems at such a remove from the verbal dexterity.
Yeah. I mean, the drunk scenes were, for me, in some ways the most challenging because, I went back and looked at lots of films where people have played drunks to, just to where to calibrate that and where to pitch that was very important to me, because I didn't want to do the cliche, staggering, slurring. And there was something, especially in terms of the relationship with the son, that's kind of pathetic and sad and embarrassing. And it was important to pitch you know, that so that you could feel the son's sort of heart breaking, going, oh no, he's not in this place again. And so it's something that Fred and I talked about quite a lot, about where to pitch it and how far to go with that, to make it believable. But it's not easy playing drunk. It's like that cliche that you try and, you know, desperately play sober, because that's what people who are very drunk tend to try and do.
I actually remember a few years ago, Michael Caine sat in the chair that you occupy right now, and I believe also talked about the character he played in Educating Rita, which is perhaps not all that far away from Jack. In fact, one of the reviews actually suggested that your character belongs in this academic fraternity that includes Michael Caine in Educating Rita and Michael Douglas in Wonder Boys. I don't know to what extent a film like Educating Rita or Michael Caine himself might have been any sort of reference.
If I'm compared to either of those two, I'm very happy.
Okay, gotcha. And at one point in this film, I got the feeling that maybe your Jack is more crippled than Dina, because even though hers is clearly a physical ailment, the alcoholism, the self-destructiveness, when he goes to the Huntsman again and just loses whatever sheer thread of credibility he had. Did you see that sort of connection in terms of a...
It's huge. It was hugely important to me because, you know, whenever you're playing a part, I mean, the film has a very kind of, it's very buoyant, it's full of verve and wit and humor. But the reality is, the opening scene of that film, he takes a bottle of vodka out of the thing, he fills his flask, and however light and deftly it's done, he's a functioning alcoholic. That's the reality. And that really is, you know, one of the reasons I want to take the part, because it's, you know, if you look back at my career, I'm always attracted to characters in conflict, people who are covering things up, people who are grappling with something, because it's more interesting, there's more to play. And that element of him really is the foundation. He's a guy that's in trouble, and, you know, that element of him is fundamental to me.
Yeah. We did show a clip from Children of Men, and for me, I did want to ask you about this because the one we just saw, this film is relatively traditional, classically made. It has a very accessible narrative, shot, reverse shot, whatever. Children of Men, I almost forgot, having seen Gravity and knowing that Alfonso Cuarón is a wonderfully visual, expressive director, that Children of Men uses these incredibly long takes. What we showed, from the moment that Julianne Moore turns around and you do... By the way, were you really doing this ping pong back and forth?
It's impossible.
That's what I thought.
In fact, I remember I was shooting, I think I was shooting Inside Man here in New York, and Alfonso, who I get on brilliantly with, called me up and said, Cabron, I have this great idea. When you're in the car, you get these... And he always tells the story that there was just silence on the end of the phone. I thought, what the hell is he on today? And, but then when you see it, you see why he did it, because it needs that kind of crazy wit and thing before you change direction.
Right. But having seen now that particular shot about 3 times in a row, I'm stunned that it was all one take. In other words, any other director would have cut at least 3 or 4 times, because I can only imagine how difficult it is to get that many layers of action. I mean, for an actor, is that even more challenging?
I love that, you see. I love that technical side of it, because, and it was very challenging for the actors in that, and it took an awful lot of rehearsal, and it was incredibly brave of Alfonso, because the rehearsal period was long, and some days we didn't shoot. You know, both that sequence and the sequence at the end going through the camp, we wouldn't shoot anything, and the studio would be saying, what are you doing? And he'd say, don't worry, when I get this, I'll get you 5 days work in one shot. And that sequence in particular, I remember him and Chivo Lubeski, the DP, talking about the concept. And there was a guy that had done the rigs on cars for 25 years who kept saying, it can't be done, mate. It can't be done. And he said, yes, it can. Yes, it can. We are going to do it. And they built this incredible vehicle that he could go on a frame, move in every direction, driven by sort of go-kart drivers on the front and on the back. And they just created that. And the same with the long shot at the end of that film, which is pretty extraordinary, was, you know, I loved it because it was really, we had a brilliant operator. And for me, being in the middle of that, it has to look completely haphazard, but it's incredibly specific because you're traveling through this and you need to see a certain amount behind me. It's like a dance. It's like a long choreographed piece of movement, and it's very exciting. I really enjoyed doing those.
And how many times, for example, did you have to do that one? Because I can imagine that for an actor doing this 2 or 3 takes, okay, but I'm guessing that there's so many elements that have to be juggled that it may have been way more takes.
I don't think it was. What we did is rehearse an awful lot so that we really got to a place where it was really ready to be done. And I remember, again, the scene at the end going through the camp, it was a half-day reset. I mean, we had tanks blowing up walls, and so if it did go wrong, it meant, you know, a long time waiting to give it another go. And I think it was probably about the 3rd take that we did. And I remember we did that shot and we went through, and both the operator and I just felt we'd nailed it. It felt that was it. It felt like everything fell into place. And Alfonso came running around the corner going, no, 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 no. Because when I ran along the bus, there was an explosion of blood and it hit the lens. And it was Chivo Lubeski, the DP, who came running up and said, that's fantastic. You have to leave that in. And that's what they did. They left the blood on the lens.
Wow, wow. And Chivo, by the way, it's Emmanuel Lubetsky, the extraordinary cinematographer, almost all of Alfonso Cuarón's films, who I think also just won the Oscar for cinematography.
For Gravity, yeah.
So a name to remember and to respect. To shift gears for a second, we showed a clip from The Boys Are Back, which I must confess to everybody I had never even heard of before doing my homework for this evening, and I found this film so poignant. And I was curious, because you're listed as producer in addition to actor. What did that mean? Because I know tomorrow a lot of people are going to go to Netflix and hopefully rent it the way I did. What drew you to this particular film? And Scott Ellis obviously had directed Shine, so there was a certain credibility that he brings as a filmmaker, but just what that film was about.
I was a producer because I came on board very, very early as we were putting the whole thing together, and I sort of put my name to it and helped them, you know, bring the whole film together. But I was very taken with that because I'm a father, and I found it a very moving story. It was based on a true story, and I found it terribly moving. And, you know, scenes where you're having to tell, you know, your son that your mother might not be around for much longer, I found every time I did it, I wanted to cry every time I read the scenes. And then you have this sort of awkward teenager who's been separated from his father, who's got to the age where he wants to get to know him. And I just thought the dynamics of that, it felt very, very real, very poignant. And we had an incredibly moving screening where the father and the 2 boys, who were that much older, came to see it. And they had to stop the screening because it was too upsetting, seeing it, them going back and reliving it and remembering it. And I thought Scott Hicks did a really beautiful job on it, very sensitively, you know, made film.
But also the beautiful job, I must say, is Clive Owen's, and I found a wonderful description from Variety. Justin Chang, when he reviewed it, said, avoiding histrionics, yet revealing the full measure of Joe's grief at quiet, wrenching intervals, Owen brings his leading man charisma to bear on a warmer role than he usually takes on. And I thought, you know, it was just one more part of this versatility that you've been manifesting in your work. It leads me to the last clip we showed tonight before the feature was from Hemingway and Gellhorn, which I found to be a visually powerful and magnificently acted film on the part of Nicole Kidman playing Martha Gellhorn, and Clive Owen, who never would have been my first image for Ernest Hemingway.
It wouldn't have been mine.
But fortunately, Philip Kaufman had that idea. By the way, the same Philip Kaufman who gave Juliette Binoche her first English language role in The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And if you could maybe tell us a little bit, because the clip we showed was when you and Martha are interacting with existing archival footage. I mean, I should have introduced this. It's not all of Hemingway and Gellhorn, which was made for HBO, that's in that sepia. But that sequence had to be because they were using footage from films, from footage that was, they were using footage that was shot during the Spanish Civil War. And the actors were relating to the characters in the documentary footage. Could you just tell us a little about that?
It was, Phil's used it before. He used it in Unbearable Lightness of Being, and and he used it more in this than I think any other.
And in The Right Stuff.
And in The Right Stuff, yeah, exactly. And then this, he kind of took it a step further. I think it was a way of like, he had researchers go out and find all this existing footage, and because of, what they can do with technology now, they could bed us into original footage, and we shot, even though the film travels all over the world, we shot the whole thing in and around San Francisco. I mean, the reason I took that film really is, it was a wonderful script, I thought, and I certainly wouldn't have thought of myself as Hemingway, but I was such a fan of Phil Kaufman. I think he is one of the greats. It was a brilliant script, and if he thought I could do it, I had to take the plunge and give it a go, and I had the most brilliant time, and he's become a great friend. He's a truly great guy.
I can't agree more. I consider him the greatest living unknown American filmmaker, because everybody recognizes the names Scorsese and Coppola, but Philip Kaufman, ? He was my guest, though, in that chair around 1993.
Wow.
To go further back. The preparation for playing an iconic role like Hemingway, how much research did you do? Did you actually go to Cuba? I'm just curious.
Food, drinking. No. I did a lot of research. I took a very long amount of time off. You can't take on a part like that, and not really give it the time that it needs, really. So I took a lot of time off. I have to be honest, I had never read Hemingway. I know, as shocking as that is, and I now have read everything. I went and traveled. I got someone to take me around a whole walking tour of Hemingway's Paris. I had an incredible week in Havana, in Cuba. I got taken around. There is the most amazing Hemingway museum where, when he died, his wife took all the paintings out of the house and donated everything else to the Cuban government. They just locked it down, and they don't really let people in. They were very nice and let me in, but everything is still as it was. So Hemingway's record collection, books, the eerie thing of going into his closet and seeing his boots and his coat still hanging. It's really, really, it was an incredible experience. I went back there more than once because it was just astonishing. I don't think there's a museum like that anywhere else in the world.
Wow.
But yeah, so I did an awful lot of research and an awful lot of work with an accent coach to try and capture his voice. Luckily, there were lots of recordings that we could use and work from. And I had a great time with him on that.
And by the way, for someone like me who watched Hemingway and Gellhorn twice and then Words and Pictures twice, you can't help but get into a kind of intertextuality where I'm remembering your Hemingway typing furiously, standing up, in the throes of creative process, compared to your Jack in front of this monitor, unable to get, more than two words.
They were both drunk, though.
The myth of the writer. Yeah. We're going to move on to another movie. Another film that I wish we had the time to show in its entirety on this stage is Shadow Dancer. I know that most of you probably never heard of it. We couldn't even find room for it in the clip reel. But it seems to take on even more resonance these days because Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams was arrested earlier this month, Sinn Féin, sorry, in Northern Ireland in connection with the IRA's 1972 abduction and killing of a Belfast widow. And in a way, that could be the summary of the backdrop of Shadow Dancer, in which you play the person who's using an IRA informant. To what extent were you aware of any real background like this when you were making this fiction film directed by James Marsh?
Once I read the script and got involved, then yeah, it became apparent that there was an awful lot of that went on. The general story is it's during the peace talks, and it starts with a girl going to, it's kind of aborting a plan to put a bomb on a train. She's taken into a room, and she meets somebody from the British government who says, "You'll never see your kid again unless you come and work for us." And she basically is put in a position where she goes back into her IRA family, and she becomes an informant. And it was one of those films, like you say, that didn't really sort of get out there and make an impact, but I think it's a really, really good film. It was directed by James Marsh, who did the documentary Man on Wire, who I think, and he did a really, really fine job. It's incredibly sort of tense, lean, really beautifully made film with a great performance from Andrea Riseborough.
Yeah, and it's a film that really retains the complexity of, people talk about conflict, you know, when you're being pushed into a vise and you have to protect your family even though you're going completely against your principles. That film really brought the tension to a pitch at the beginning. One thing I didn't get to talk about earlier, so I'll raise it now, is that you've had this very rich career on stage. We know you as a film actor, whether British or American motion pictures. Your roles include Romeo at the Young Vic and Sean Matthias' staging of Noel Coward's Design for Living, and of course the lead in Patrick Marber's original production of Closer at the Royal National Theatre in 1997. How did it end up that in Mike Nichols' film version of Closer, you played the other part, not the one that you originated?
Well, to be honest with you, when I first read the play, I wanted that part. I wanted the part, but Patrick Marber thought I was too young. And they were workshopping the play at the National, and I went off and did something else. And then a year later, they were putting the production on for the first time at the National. And my agent said, do you know that they're doing Closer? And I said, oh, that was a great part, what a great play. He said, well, you know, Kieran Hines is playing Larry, but what do you think about playing Dan? And I said, there's 4 great parts in this play. You know, I'll play one of the girls if you know, if you give me, you know, they're just brilliant parts for actors. And so I ended up in the original production playing Dan and had a great time, and the play had a big impact in London. And it was like a gift, really, because 7 years later, I get a call saying Mike Nichols wants to meet up with you. And I went and met him, and he said, how do you feel about playing Larry in the film with Julia Roberts, Jude Law, and Natalie Portman? And it was, you know, it was a part that I'd really wanted before. And I remember walking out, the meeting was here in New York, and I remember walking out so sort of high from that meeting because I just knew how good the writing was in that thing, and the opportunity to do that caliber of language and dialogue on film, to me, was like a gift.
Not to mention having Mike Nichols direct it. You don't get up too much higher than that. Which also leads me to a question, because when I think of the directors with whom you've worked, it's a quite impressive roster. We've already heard about Philip Kaufman and Mike Nichols, but Mike Hodges with Croupier, James Marsh, Tom Tykwer.
Yeah.
One of my favorite directors. I'm one of the crazy people who loved Cloud Atlas, you know, about a year and a half ago. Alfonso Cuarón, Spike Lee, Shekhar Kapoor, Robert Altman.
Not bad, bunch.
Not bad
when you reel them off like that.
Bad.
Yeah.
And what is it that any of these directors in particular has done that you feel brings out the best of what an actor can do? I know it's all about creating trust and confidence, but is there something that any of these directors, whether it's in common or not, also Tony Gilroy with Duplicity, you know, what is it that you appreciate most from what these directors have brought?
You know, I could talk for a long time about this because, you know, each of those directors has different strengths and different gifts, but you know, a few things that come to mind is, you know, a lot of people talk about how Mike Nichols is one of the great directors at directing actors, and it's because he puts actors in a place where they can feel they can do anything. And you hear stories sometimes, all I have throughout my career, about directors putting actors under a weird pressure, thinking it will squeeze a performance out if they put them in a strange place and that can make something happen. I'm not a great believer in that. I'm a believer in the Mike Nichols thing, which is make an actor feel like they can do anything, because then they'll do their best work. Because acting ultimately is about confidence. You have to believe 100%, and then play with that, and that's when it's at its best. And then, you know, I think of other things like working with Altman, who was the greatest director at working with ensemble actors and creating scenes with lots of actors, keeping the ball in the air, getting just enough information, traveling through a whole thing, but never feeling like you got too much or not enough. And I remember him, when we did Gosford Park, it was shot at upstairs and downstairs, and we were all given this memo saying, even if you're not called, can you please come in and get ready every day, because he might want you. And no actor on that film had a trailer. Everyone was in a little three-way, and there were some pretty serious actors in that movie. And you would come in, you would go through the works. It was period, so you'd put the clothes on, and very often it'd get to lunchtime and you were released, or you'd get called, and he would be putting together one of those, shots. And I remember he was putting one of those together one day, and it was like watching somebody compose music, and now sending him through, and now doing this. And he goes, "Okay, everybody, we're going to go for the first take. Remember, if you know what you're doing, we won't notice you. If you don't, we will." And I thought that was genius.
Yep. We actually, some people in this audience may have been here, we previewed Gosford Park in real pieces with Robert Altman sitting in that chair.
Wow.
And he talked about the process. And he, like Cuarón, I mean, there are certain directors that have a choreographic sense of how the camera should be narrating with groups of people. And other directors who excel more, I think, with respecting the script, the language, the character, and not quite as interested in the visual, well, may I say the pictures aspect over the words aspect.
True.
But you've worked with both. I was also curious about actors who have been inspirational for you. I mean, I've never read anything about this in terms of your selections, but when I was jotting down who I thought you might have considered as role models, I thought Robert Mitchum, maybe Sean Connery, Bogart, I don't know. Which actors?
I'll take any of them.
Were there some that particularly led you into wanting to become a performer yourself?
No, not really. No, as a kid, I was just crazy about David Bowie more than any actor. So no, that wasn't, what my sort of way in was just developing a passion for the theatre, about doing a school play and joining a youth theatre and discovering plays and loving it. And I didn't really have a kind of acting role model. I mean, obviously as I got older, you go back and you look at actors. I was a huge fan of Bogart, big fan of Alain Delon. Like there's a whole, there's a lot of brilliant actors out there.
When you mentioned Alain Delon, that made me think of, we did a very short clip from Croupier, but I could almost picture that kind of reserve in, I don't know, Le Samouraï or something that Alain Delon would have done with
He was a lot better looking than me, let me tell you, Alain Delon. And he had a lot more poise than me, I think.
I'm not going to comment on that. Before we take questions from the audience, I have one more that I do want to know about. You are working with Steven Soderbergh on a project called The Knick, and I was hoping you could just tell us a little of what that is.
Yeah, Steven rang me and said, "I think I might do this television series. I'm going to send you a script." And I'm a huge fan of Steven Soderbergh, so obviously I was very excited to hear that, but I wasn't sure that I was ready to commit to 10 hours of television. And then I was shooting something else. I was sitting in my trailer, and I thought I'd just have a little look at the first few pages to see the sort of what this is. And 25 minutes later, I called my agent and said, "This is fantastic." It's a brilliant premise. It's inspired by, it's an inspiration, so it's completely away from him, but by a doctor called William Halsted, who was a brilliant doctor at the turn of the century in New York, who was also consuming vast amounts of drugs. It was at the time when cocaine was legal, and this series is set in the world of medicine, and that's what I play, a doctor that is kind of brilliant but struggling with that, and it's just wonderful, wonderful writing, and it kind of spreads. That is used as a device to have a look at everything that was going on in New York at that time. It's a wonderful way of seeing that. And it was a hugely exciting time in the world of medicine. They were learning so fast at that point. That there's something I say in it, which is that we've learned more in the last 10 years than we've learned in the previous 500. I mean, that's how quick things were moving at that time. So it's a brilliant.
This is for Cinemax?
It's for Cinemax, and it's 10 hours. And Soderbergh did an unusual thing in that he wanted to shoot it like a 10-hour movie rather than episodically. So he literally, we would shoot it like that. We would shoot it in blocks, but we would go to locations and shoot the scenes from all 10 episodes.
Is there any intention of making a shortened film version that would be, at least for Europe, in theaters, or is it absolutely just the 10 episodes?
No, and it's incredibly rich. It has fantastic storylines, and it's really unusual.
And you're also a producer on this?
Yes, again, he came in when he just had that one script, and then we kind of came together and we took it together to see who wanted to make it. And the first place we went to was HBO, and they said, "Do you want to do it for Cinemax?"
Wow. Well, at Columbia, where I teach, our students are increasingly aware that television is a far more likely home for really strong writing and idiosyncratic projects than the traditional feature route, and a lot of our alumni have gone straight to working for televisions, creating pilots and whatever else. We have time for a few questions. If we can just quickly raise the lights. If you raise your hand, I will also repeat the question, and I see one over to my left. Yes? Do you have any plans to bring Words and Pictures to Broadway? In other words, could there be a stage version? I guess
it's not a bad idea, actually. It probably would. Yeah, it probably would hold up in the theatre. No, I mean, it wasn't a play. It was written as a screenplay. It's just that when I read it, I always felt it read like a theatre because it was so kind of fully formed and well structured. But I think that's not a bad idea. I think it could be.
To put it bluntly, given the number of current Broadway shows that are adapted from films, it used to be the other way around, maybe even a musical, because that's what's been happening. Sorry. Yes, right there.
This is sort of a personal question. I think the film may be misnamed. It should be Words, Pictures, and Music, because there was a strong component of music being the healer in many scenes. What is your bias between words, pictures, and music?
The question is, perhaps the title should have been Words, Pictures, and Music, because music does play an important role, almost healing in some of the scenes. Would you have any sort of a bias in terms of any of the three?
I don't think I would really, no. I think that it's quite hard to separate. I know in this film that we have a war between words and pictures, but I think all those three things together are hugely important.
And there's even, I think, that nice moment where we see Dina turning off the music that obviously is her music to paint with.
Yeah.
I found that kind of effective because it was another way of her showing, I'm not gonna just do what you want, I'm turning off my sound, so to speak. And almost as if her pictures and the music go together, whereas your words are, extraneous in a way.
Exactly.
That's true. That Jack also uses the music to speak to her when he no longer has the words.
Yep.
Yes. On the aisle?
I thought you nailed the American accent really well. How did you to learn how to speak like these?
How did you nail that American accent
Thank
so
you for
well?
that. It's always, no, I was very lucky. When I did, I'd heard about him and heard brilliant things. When I did the Hemingway project, I came across this guy called Tim Monach, who is widely regarded as the kind of greatest accent coach out there. And I went after him, and I went to Phil, and I said, I'll take on Hemingway, but I think I need this guy, because it's going to be a big leap for me to try and crack Hemingway's voice. And I worked with him, and he was absolutely brilliant. So I managed, he's worked with Fred Skepsey, the director of this film, a number of times on different films. And again, I managed to get him for this. So it's with an awful lot of help from him, really. And it's a very kind of technical process. He does an awful lot of work. He breaks it down. It's a real long process. And it's a very important one, because if you feel short in an accent, if you feel you're not quite getting there, it's incredibly hard to be instinctive. And acting is about instincts. You end up kind of trapped in the accent because you're just trying to nail the sounds and sound convincing. Whereas somebody like Tim Monach gets you to a place where you have the confidence to do the accent and be totally free and feel impulsive. And that was a big change for me from before I worked with him, when I'd tried to do accents before. So it's huge credit to him, really.
Gentleman right here.
I wonder if there's any encouragement or discouragement for contributing your own language, anyway, improvisation.
Was there any encouragement or discouragement to contributing your own language in this film? Any improvisation?
I'm not a huge fan of improvising, I have to say. I think sometimes if it's a scene that's supposed to be fun or frivolous or light, that you can maybe get away with it. I'm a great believer that a really good writer can write better lines than I can think up in situ, and my job is to try and make it look like I'm improvising. That's what the job of acting is. And I find sometimes, you know, when you're sort of left to do it yourself, it's not as fine as a good writer can do. I'm much, much more comfortable having some really great lines and trying to find a shape and a rhythm and make it feel as natural and instinctive as possible.
Yes.
So, I don't know if you read New York Times Magazine, but they have the new words of the year, and I was wondering if maybe during the film you had a new word that you could share with us?
The New York Times Magazine has new words for the year. Did you have any new words that came from this film that...
I think there was a few that Fred Skepsey thought of, but they're too rude to say in this room.
Later, we'll tell you, we'll send a note back. Yes, right there.
You mentioned that you began your career in theater. Have you had an opportunity to do any theater either in London or, well, not here, no, I think, but in London during this time that you began?
You began in theater. Have you had any opportunity more recently to return to doing theater?
I have had opportunities. I haven't done a play for a very long time, is the truth, and it's odd because that is where I started. And when, you know, after I left drama school, it's all I wanted to do. I wasn't really interested in television and film. I just wanted to do theatre. But it's been an awful long time, and I very recently, very nearly took on a play for the first time. And but I think I'm sort of being very careful because I know how challenging doing a play is, and I just want, when I go back, to be completely passionate and have enormous appetite for it, because, you know, the one thing I've learned both in film and theatre is appetite is everything. If you feel strongly that you've got things to do and you want to do them, then that will carry you through any experience. And I am seriously thinking about, you know, going back to the theatre. I've just got to find the right play now.
We have time for like one more question if there is one. Yes.
When you did the BMW commercials, that's when I first got your attention.
Okay, and I'm glad you're raising this because it was going to be my next question if I had a chance. BMW had Clive Owen starring in a number of short films that were directed by Alejandro González Iñárritu, Ang Lee, Wong Kar-wai, Guy Ritchie, John Frankenheimer. Okay, continue.
So, well, for me, that's the first time I noticed you. So, is that how you got into the American market?
Since it's the first time this woman noticed Clive Owen, is that how you got into the American market?
It was at the very beginning. I'd done a number of small British films, but really the thing that changed everything for me was this little film, Croupier. It was a very small film. It was directed by Mike Hodges, who did the original, thank you, who did the original Get Carter, and it was a very unusual, kind of special, unique little film, and it kind of made an impact in America, in a small film way, but it became sort of the cool, small indie film of that year, really, and it kind of then opened things up for me. And the BMW things happened soon after that, the impact of that, really. But I do remember turning them down a couple of times because in my head I was thinking, is it really a smart thing to sort of start to make yourself some space and sign on to do a load of commercials? I wasn't sure that was. And then I remember that eventually I thought it had gone away and they'd gone somewhere else. And it was literally 2 days before they were going to shoot the first one, and they said, really, would you please reconsider? And they had John Frankenheimer directing, and the guy who wrote Seven had written the first thing, And the next day I was out on a plane to LA going, I think I should do these. And they were extraordinary. But it was a very unusual and bold campaign for the time because it was internet only. So they had billboards everywhere, they had trailers on TV as if it was a movie, but the only way you could see the full 7-8 minute movie was to go to the BMW website. And they were very expensive because they got top directors and give them good budgets to make them. So it was a very unusual, campaign at that time, quite groundbreaking. And I ended up doing sort of 8 of them and working with some amazing people, yeah.
Always playing the driver, right?
Yeah.
In other words, it's a not verbal part, but one that I think a lot of us thought were remarkable because it also allowed the directors to manifest their wonderful visual style. Since there's quite a round of early morning stuff that Clive Owen is doing to promote this film, which, by the way, tell your friends, opens on Friday, May 23rd, at the Paris Theatre, and at least one other one that just escaped my mind, but it's in your printed program. But I just want to close by quoting one line that I believe your character, Hemingway, says in Hemingway and Gellhorn, because I find it quite applicable to you as a guest, and that is, happiness in intelligent people is the rarest thing I know. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.